Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Laura.
I'm Kate.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Today we bring you Bookshelf, an episode dedicated to the books we're each reading outside of book club, the ones that we get to pick and choose. On my list this week, I have Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, Life Among the Savages by Shirley Jackson, and To Calais in Ordinary Time by James Meek.
And on my list, we have Himself by Jess Kidd, The Observations by Jane Harris, and Midnight in Sicily by Robb.
Keep listening to hear what we thought of them. You never know, we might find some gems for book club in there.
All that coming up here on the Book Club Review. Here we are in the shed, where we may not be for much longer.
And it's been so long since our last bookshelf. I didn't realise, I think we haven't done one since, the summer, since June.
It's because you keep adding in these really exciting features for our listeners, but they take us away from
reading.
Our regular reading.
That's true. Well, so it's very nice to be back together again, talking about our non-required reading, as I think of it.
I think of it as the books I really want to read. I mean, I love reading book club books, but of course that's part of being a part of a book club, is that it makes you read outside your comfort zone, whereas when you get to pick your own books, you tend to choose books you know you're going to really enjoy.
Yeah, exactly. What have you got in your stack?
I'm going to start with Himself by Jess Kidd. Have you ever come across Jess Kidd?
No.
She's great.
Ah.
Yeah. Andy, who's in your book club and one of my friends, lent this to me. He has great taste in books, I think. I would say Andy probably doesn't like 80% of the books that I like, but I like 100% of the books he likes. He's quite tricky to please. This is, I guess it's a crime novel, which I do not read. But it's much more than that. It's surreal and fantastical.
It's got quite an ambiguous cover. It's not one of those covers that really telegraphs the genre.
Yeah. And quite difficult to describe.
Yeah,
for our listeners.
It's a sort of silhouette of some kind of bird, maybe a crow, cut through a sort of abstract background of foliage, I'd say.
Yeah, that's right.
Picking up on the current vogue, I might add, I've noticed, for cutouts on book covers.
Interesting.
It's a thing.
It also has something of the Gothic about it.
Yes.
And I am always drawn to a Gothic cover. What is it about? Well, it is the debut novel of Jess Kidd, who was born in London but grew up in a large family from County Mayo. This is her first novel. 1950, a teenage girl is brutally murdered in a forest, but somehow her baby survives. 1976, a mysterious and charming young man returns to the remote coastal village of Mulderig, seeking answers about the mother who, it was said, had abandoned him on the steps of a Dublin orphanage. With the help of its oldest and most eccentric inhabitant, he will force the village to give up its ghosts. Nothing, not even the dead, can stay buried forever. Now, I don't read crime. You don't really read crime.
No.
And I have a particular aversion to crime that centers around the murder of women, because I feel like so often it's sensationalized and their deaths are just treated as a plot device, right? They're not treated sensitively and the women themselves aren't given their own stories. This is quite the opposite. It's brutal. The opening chapter is a vivid description of this young girl. She's probably 14 or 15, being beaten to death by her former lover with her, talk about trigger warnings, with her baby beside her.
Oh my God.
This is the first chapter, so I'm not giving much away. As her murderer then takes her away to be buried, the baby is absorbed by the forest. And this is the first moment where you realize not all is as it would seem in this world. It's our world. But there are ghosts everywhere and the forest is alive with its own consciousness. And so when the murderer comes back and he's going to bury the baby alive, again, oh my God, the baby's gone. And then you flash forward 26 years later and the baby is now a young man and he has only just been given a letter that accompanied him when he arrived at a Dublin orphanage saying, your mother was taken from the village wanted rid of her, this is your real name, this is your mother's name. And there's this photo of him with his mother and he thinks she couldn't have been more than 14. And her son, his name is Mahoney, is this incredibly good-looking, charismatic, charming man. But he's really there to find out what happened to his mother. And the village is kind of closing shop. They don't want to go back to it.
Did he grow up in the forest then?
No, orphanage.
The forest somehow put him in the orphan?
Well, that's the thing, Kate. Who knows? Will you find out? I'm not going to tell you.
Okay.
It's beautifully written, very unusual. As I say, there are ghosts, so there's something of Lincoln and the Bardo in it, in that Mahony can see ghosts, and the ghosts are shadows of themselves. They're not the same people they were in life, and at the same time, they're trying to help him as much as they can. And then there's really surreal moments like the really horrible Father Quinn, the priest, who's trying to get Mahony out of the village. He is plagued by a spring that sprouts up in his living room. Every morning the cleaner comes to take all the frogs away, and every morning there's more frogs. It's quite bizarre, but great. I think it'd be a fantastic book club book. I'd highly recommend it. I've never read anyone quite like Jess Kidd.
Yep, I never heard of her either. Brilliant.
Well, I should say, the rest of the world has heard of her.
Yeah, well, that's not in any way unusual.
This book was a BBC Radio 2 book club book, so I'm not alone in thinking it'd be a great book club book. She won the Authors Club Best First Novel Award. She's getting the attention she deserves, but yeah, a revelation for me.
That sounds great. I want to add that to my TBR pile. Do you want to hear what I've been reading?
Nah.
Nah.
I do, because I'm mildly bitter. You're going to talk about Piranesi by Susanna Clarke.
Yeah.
Which I really want to read. I would like to read it right now, but do you know why I can't read it?
Why can't you read it? Oh, I do know. You tell the listeners that they don't know.
Listeners, we are planning a Booker Prize special.
A bookathon.
A Bookathon, yes, that can be what it's called, where we are going to read at least 3 of the Booker Prize nominees ahead of the winner being announced in November. So that's what I'm doing.
So I had a bee in my bonnet that if we were going to discuss them, it needed to be a book club discussion. In order for it to be a book club discussion, we need to have at least 2 people who've read every book, which means that because we have 2 guests, and I'm reasonably certain about the maths now, that means that each of us have to read 3. But Laura is a masochist because she recklessly went in and started reading one before finding out what her assigned books were. She's actually reading 4.
I read the book I wanted to read.
Yeah, that's true.
So yes, Susanna Clarke, Piranesi.
Well, I predict that you will love this when you get to it. Most people, I think, would be familiar with Susanna Clarke's first book, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is a book I absolutely loved. So I was quite nervous about this one. I just thought, what if it's not as good? And also, it's been 15 years since she wrote that first book, and I know that she's been quite open about the fact that she suffered a strange, debilitating condition that's been sort of variously diagnosed with. I think they're calling it chronic fatigue syndrome. Basically, it's meant that she's been kind of a prisoner in her own body in some ways. It's almost like her own body's turned against her and she just was exhausted and she couldn't really go out. Quite often she has to just sit in darkened rooms. It feels like such a gift that she was able to write this book in a way. And I think also overcome her own self-doubt, which she's sort of plagued by. And so this book has come out into the world. And it's a very nice thing that it has. It's got this beautiful cover, and on the cover is a faun. And I just wanted to read a little paragraph about that faun, and it gives you a sense of this character, Piranesi. He's a guide. In this strange place he lives, it's a succession of stone halls that seemingly have no end. And they're peopled by these statues. And that's kind of all that's there, really, apart from the tides, which are down in the lower halls. So this is either the sort of seascape that's down there. And then in the upper halls, it's like the kind of more elemental space where there's clouds and the birds. And he lives there, and he survives on shellfish and seaweed, which he gathers and eats.
I was going to ask, is he human? But no, he's a satyr?
No, so he is human, and he's making observations about the things that he sees. It's almost like he's cataloguing things. There are some statues, he says, that I love more than the rest. The woman carrying a beehive is one. Another, perhaps the statue that I love above all others, stands at a door between the 5th and 4th northwestern halls. It is the statue of a faun, a creature half man, half goat, with a head of exuberant curls. He smiles slightly and presses his forefinger to his lips. I have always felt that he meant to tell me something, or perhaps to warn me of something. Quiet, he seems to say. Be careful. But what danger there could possibly be, I have never known. I dreamt of him once. He was standing in a snowy forest and speaking to a female child. So you're in this fantastical place. There's someone who seems to be not a human in a way. He doesn't seem to have the frame of reference that we have. And yet there's a memory there or something about Narnia. and the faun talking to Lucy. And
Of actual Narnia?
yeah, little references, but
Really?
you don't know, you don't understand. And you're like,
Oh.
well, where's that coming from? You know, and at that point I was just like, oh, that's so magical. I love that little detail. But as the novel goes on, you start to realise that all these little details that are woven in are actually telling a bigger story, and he is only a part of it. And the pleasure in this, I think, is twofold. I think one is just in this place that she conjures up that is so powerful and evocative. I really think once you've read it, you would never forget it. And you kind of walk there, you live there with him. And the other is, it's like a very clever puzzle of a book. And once you've completed it, once you've got to the end and you've found out how all the pieces slot together, there's just a real pleasure in almost like wanting to see how it was done, which is why, having finished it, I almost immediately turned back and wanted to start it again. And in fact, even just picking it up to think about talking about it today, I found myself reading it very happily, like kind of dipping in and then, I'll just read a bit more, you know.
Will you loan me your copy? Or do you feel that will just...
besmirch it?
No, I was going to say, well, perhaps. No, but I was going to say, do you think that will just derail my Booker Prize winning reading?
Well, the thing is, it's not a long read. You know, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell was 800 pages. And actually, I did just want to flag up, there's a really wonderful article about Susanna Clarke on the New Yorker, trusty New Yorker. It's by Laura Miller. I just want to read the bit where she explained about Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. People haven't read that book. Maybe they're aware of it. There was a TV series. So, you know, it's...
Which I have never watched.
Oh, it was good,
somehow.
actually. Yeah, I'm usually very wary of TV adaptations of books, especially books that I loved. But I thought they did a good job with Jonathan Strange. I think the casting was very good. She said, the novel, set in an alternative version of England during the Regency period, describes the partnership between two magicians and how it degenerates into rivalry. Executed in an exquisite pastiche of the precise, ironical prose of Jane Austen, it reads less like a novel than like a slice of an ongoing history. Although the book is more than 800 pages long, it feels as if it were a mere fragment of a fully imagined reality. And that was the phrase I thought was so clever. It's true. You read this whole 800-page novel and you still feel like you've just had a little tiny piece of it. And I think that's why everyone was so, please write a sequel, like we have to know more. And the other thing about that novel is that there are all these footnotes. And even in the footnotes, which are often quite extended, they'll go on for a few paragraphs, it was like there were whole worlds conjured up in the footnotes that you wanted to know more about, and instead you just got this little fragment. And this Piranesi feels a bit like that. It almost feels like one of those footnotes that you've gone into and she's really expanded the story, and it's just such a delight. I really loved it, and I think it would be great for book club, partly because it's such a pleasurable read and it's beautifully written, but also I think it's really interesting the way that it's constructed.
I want to read it.
Yeah, it's good.
You didn't answer my question. Can I borrow it?
Yeah, you can borrow it. Unusually for me, it's a very beautiful hardback edition that I bought for myself on Bookshop Day the other weekend.
Ah.
Yeah, it was great. I had a really fun day.
I will return it.
So tell me about what's that grey covered book that you've got on your stack there?
Oh, well, no useful segue to talk about that one, I have to say, because it's completely opposite to Piranesi. It is Midnight in Sicily by Peter Robb. Gosh. Most of my reading has been dictated by Andy recently. This is another loan from Andy.
Well, you did go on holiday with him.
We did go on holiday.
You've been exposed to him a lot.
He also just has great taste in books. And he gave me a stack of books about Sicily. This one is about the mafia, and you would not think... It's not something I would naturally turn to. It's not a subject that I would read. But my God, is it gripping.
Mm. Did you read it then? You went to Sicily on holiday. Was it a kind of thing where you wanted to read about the place you were in?
Yes.
Yeah.
Except
yeah.
I didn't read it while I was there.
Yeah.
I started reading it when I got home. And guess what, Kate? I've had to stop reading it to do some other reading. But I'm about a third of the way in. Peter Robb is a writer, is a journalist, and he lived in Naples throughout the 1980s. And in 1994, I think, this edition is a vintage classic. This isn't a recent book. The title is Midnight in Sicily, on art, food, history, travel, and Cosa Nostra, which is the name for the Sicilian mafia. Published in 1996. It is so gripping. It reads like a thriller, and I actually have to catch my breath sometimes by the scale of the corruption and the murderous intent and execution by the mafia. In the early 90s, they were just picking off the investigators who had full retinues of personal protection surrounding them, but they were blowing them up while they were driving from the airport surrounded by protection. I don't know much about the mafia, but until 1994, very few people did know much about it. It wasn't until there were these really groundbreaking cases that the scale of corruption and collaboration between the mafia and Italian politicians came to the fore, and Robb tells that story brilliantly, while equally weaving in, as the subtitle suggests, tales of the history of Sicily, the art of Sicily. It's really like a travel memoir often, because he's talking to people who live there. It's fantastic, and I would really like to keep reading it. You know what? I think it'd be a really good book club book too. It's one of those books that you'd love to discuss. I keep on stopping, putting it down, and turning to my husband and being like, can you believe this? It's fascinating. It's so good.
I was going to talk about it today because I haven't finished it, but I'm reading the Elena Ferrante, The Lying Life of Adults. And one of the things that's a real pleasure in that is being back in that world of Naples from the My Brilliant Friend quartet.
One of the things that's really interesting about this book, one of the facts that I turned to my husband Adam had said, is Peter Robb has lived in Naples, and he talks about how Naples is this thriving city where people live on the streets and they live in the centre, and it's just teeming with life and community. And Palermo is the opposite, because in the 1950s and 1960s, the mafia basically siphoned off all of this money that was given to the state. All of the local politicians were exceptionally corrupt for the most part, and they built this really lousy housing around Palermo, and then they forced people to move through coercion and violence, so that Palermo city centre was kind of hollowed out, and people who had lived in these streets with their families for hundreds of years were just pushed out into this really shoddily built housing. Peter Robb says Palermo, maybe it's different today, you know, it's been over 20 years, but back then he was just like, you can't compare the two cities. It's a tragedy what's happened to Palermo.
Well, my next one is a memoir by Shirley Jackson, Life Among the Savages, it's called. 2 years ago, I'd never read a Shirley Jackson novel. And then Andy from the Horror Book Club came along and introduced us to The Haunting of Hill House. And my mind was blown because she's amazing, Shirley Jackson. And also, I think for anyone like me and Laura who's kind of scaredy cats about reading horror, definitely it's a horror novel, but it's not going to keep you awake at night.
No, it's beautiful too.
Not that terrifying, more just really sort of haunting and atmospheric. So then it was a real surprise. I can't even remember why I picked this up. Maybe it was the cover. It has this very arresting photograph, and it's her memoir of her life among the savages, it's called, but the savages turn out to be her family. She had 3 children. In fact, it starts off with 2, and then she has the 3rd in the course of this book, and the husband. Can I just read the opening?
Of
I
course.
just love the opening's so great, and it gives you a sense of what it's like. Our house is old and noisy and full. When we moved into it, we had 2 children and about 5,000 books. I expect that when we finally overflow and move out again, we will have perhaps 20 children and easily 500,000 books. We also own assorted beds and tables and chairs and rocking horses and lamps and dolls' dresses and ship's models and paintbrushes and literally thousands of socks. This is the way of life my husband and I have fallen into, inadvertently, as though we had fallen into a well and decided that since there was no way out, we might as well stay there and set up a chair and a desk and a light of some kind. Even though this is our way of life, and the only one we know, it is occasionally bewildering and perhaps even inexplicable to the sort of person who does not have that swift, accurate conviction he's going to step on a broken celluloid doll in the dark. I cannot think of a preferable way of life, except one without children and without books, going on soundlessly in an apartment hotel where they do the cleaning for you and send up your meals, and all you have to do is lie on a couch and... As I say, I cannot think of a preferable way of life, but then I have had to make a good many compromises, all told. And I mean, just in that one paragraph, there's just so much kind of richness there. I loved it. And even, you know, that little bit about the stepping on the broken celluloid doll. And, you know, you get these little flashes of what it was that makes her horror fiction so disturbing and uncanny and all of that you don't get much of that in this. But you do get these little touches. And funny enough, what you get that's so surprising in this is just this kind of warmth and humour, and... she's really good on family life. There's lots of love in there, but she's never sentimental. You know, with the children, she never sentimentalizes that relationship or the things that they do. And I think that's what I loved about it so much. It's kind of detached in a way and wry, but full of observations that anyone with children, anyone who lives in a house overflowing with books, will just delight in.
Fair to say you saw yourself in her?
Well, maybe just a little bit. she's pre-Marie Kondo. Marie Kondo would have sorted her right out. She... I don't think had such a happy life in reality. And I mean, you know, there's almost, it's not all sweetness and light, the things that happen in this book. although it's all related in a very comic tone, it kind of maybe belies the actual severity sometimes of things that went on. You know, there's a thing at the beginning where they're kicked out of their apartment that they've rented and they have a sort of desperate search to find a new house, and then they end up in this house that becomes a rambling house. And it's all told very lightly, but actually, it's like a big upheaval.
Right.
I think in reality, her relationship with her husband was not an easy one. I think what you get in here is the love, which I think, you know, there must have been, but he was not kind to her. He, as I understand it, resented her for being more successful and a better writer than he was. He definitely had numerous affairs that he would just tell her about. He didn't even, you know, do her the courtesy of trying to keep them a secret.
Are they related in this book?
No,
I see. Okay.
So you don't get any of that. And in fact, the husband in this is just this kind of, almost reminded me of the husband in The Diary of a Provincial Lady by E.M. Delafield, you know, where he's sort of there. But he's off in the other room, you know, with a pipe, like reading the paper. And yet, when he does say something, often it's a kind of dry remark that adds to the comedy.
She died young, didn't she?
She died, I mean, she was 48 when she died, which is just really chilling to me and really sad. They made a film quite recently with
Elizabeth Moss.
Thank you, Elizabeth Moss.
I think it's premiering right now with the London Film Festival.
And I watched the trailer and I was sort of sat back on my chair because I was like, wow, it was kind of shocking to me because that seemed very dark and that almost seemed to be depicting a kind of twisted relationship where they delighted in playing psychological games on other people and it was just so at odds with the impression that I had of her from this book, and I couldn't kind of marry up the two, and I haven't seen the film yet. I will be interested to see it, to kind of see that side of the story. I did read an article where apparently her son, who features in this book, one of those little New Yorker snippet profiles where they get famous people together at the beginning, and it was about Elizabeth Moss, and she met the son at the premiere or something of this, and I think had worked really carefully and really hard to be as authentic and true to Shirley Jackson as they could be. So I don't know if she was like nervous meeting him, but, you know, obviously she was interested to know his take on it. And he just said, you didn't get her sense of humour. That's the thing that you missed. And I think that's what you get. That's what's preserved in this book, which I think she wrote really pragmatically to make money. I think much like E.M. Delafield, these stories went off to places like Good Housekeeping, and that's what brought the money in that kept their family afloat.
Right, yeah.
But it doesn't feel, it just feels like there's a lot of truth in there. It didn't feel artificial to me.
Even though she's not telling you everything.
Exactly, yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Well, we do that in life, don't we? Sometimes we compartmentalise.
Yeah, very much so. Apparently there's a sequel, which is called Raising Demons, which our friend Simon Thomas of the Book of the Year Club messaged me to say is just as good as this. So I will definitely be reading that.
Great.
But I might start giving this to people who are having children. I think it'd be a good thing. It's like, here you go.
It looks very readable.
Do you want to do my other heavyweight book before you go on to talk about the last book I can see?
Oh, no. Well, see, that's not even my last book.
Oh.
That's like my secret book that I didn't mention in the intro.
Oh.
So listeners, keep listening. But, you know, you do yours. Yeah, you do your heavy one.
Well, this one's a bit of a funny one. So this, Laura Potter, ought to be your guilty confession rather than mine, although I also have a guilty confession to make about it. This is To Calais in Ordinary Time by James Meek. This was the last book but one that my book club did, and you did not read it.
I have not read it.
And even I only made it. I made it a fair halfway through. What is it? Hang on a minute.
Who chose this book?
It's nearly a 400-page book, and I got to page 203.
Okay.
Put it down, and I have not picked it up again.
What's it about?
Who chose it? Well, I can't quite remember who exactly it was, but I remember we had all heard that his book, The People's Act of Love, was supposed to be amazing. And then this one, it's set in the Middle Ages, but it had a kind of contemporary resonance because it's dealing with people who are fleeing from the plague. And at that time, as indeed is sort of starting to happen again, but, you know, everyone was very, very, very worried about the virus in the air. And it just felt like, oh, okay, maybe this would be, I don't know why. I think mainly it was because it has like 8 pages of ridiculously over-enthusiastic quotes from people saying how brilliant it is at the beginning, and we were slightly swayed. And Hilary Mantel says, fans of intelligent historical fiction will be enthralled. England, 1348. A gentlewoman flees an odious arranged marriage. A proctor sets out for a monastery in Avignon, and a young ploughman in search of freedom is on his way to volunteer with a company of archers. All come together on the road to Calais. In the other direction comes the Black Death, the plague that will wipe out half of the population of Northern Europe. To Calais in Ordinary Time is an exploration of love, death and power against the backdrop of catastrophe. Well, now I'm, with a little bit of distance, I'm like, what were we thinking?
Bunch of masochists.
In choosing this.
You haven't even mentioned the key fact that I took away when you mentioned it previously, which is it's written in ye olde English.
It is written in very authentic ye olde English. So anyone who ever did Chaucer, at school or university will recognise the kind of Poggy, ye nay understand allegory, just listen. In being pierced with these 5 arrows, love has crippled him. Certainly it is a great inconvenience to a man going about his affairs to have 5 arrows sticking out of him. Shh, no more interruptions. He is crippled by love. He is love's vassal. When he was here in Oughton Green, he told me even were his will otherwise, he couldn't but love me par amour. He is all that love's demands. Each of the characters speaks in a different kind of English. So this is Berna, who is the aristocratic daughter of a wealthy household, who is fleeing this oppressive arranged marriage with a man sort of, nearly twice as old as she is. And she speaks in a kind of courtly English, the language of knights and romances. And then there is the proctor sent from the abbey, who speaks in a kind of almost like formal English, the Latinised English. His speech is almost like church sermons. And then there's the bowman and the sort of rude mechanical types who all speak in this very earthy vernacular, I suppose. It's genuinely quite hard to understand. I don't think, for me, he did a good enough job of bridging that gap between what feels like it must be very authentic speech, as it was then, and the story that he was trying to tell. There was a major plot point, which, should I spoil it? I almost feel like could potentially be the kind of turning point of the whole book, and that maybe I shouldn't potentially ruin it for people. But there's a major twist that's to do with the gender of one of the characters. And I have to say, I only found out about this in book club when people were talking about it. I was like, hang on a minute, what? And they were like, didn't you realise? I was like, no.
Was that because you hadn't finished it?
I was not alone. There were other people there who also hadn't twigged what was going on. No, because it's what happens in the middle. I think it's just I was concentrating so hard almost on the individual sentences that I was losing sight of the bigger picture of what was happening. But I think the main thing that really made it something I just didn't want to pick up is that no one is really very nice in this. And in fact, everyone is pretty awful. They're all just in fairly hopeless situations, chasing dreams that are never going to happen, and in fact deliberately seem to do whatever they can to make other people's lives miserable. I didn't find anyone in it that I sort of liked or rooted for. I really didn't care if all of them died of the Black Death, as indeed they may do for all I know. If they do ever get to Calais. But it was kind of a shock because Amanda in my book club had read The People's Act of Love and said it was incredible. And Jenny, do you remember lovely Irish Jenny who came on the show? She gave me a copy of The People's Act of Love saying this book is amazing. You must read it. And I have it. It's down there. I'm so sorry, Jenny. I still haven't.
You're reading the wrong book.
I know. That's the thing. And that was what I was like. I was like, oh my God, we read the wrong book.
Right.
We read the wrong James Meek book. Because James Meek is clearly a really, really, really interesting writer. It's not badly written. It's almost like it's too well written to comprehend. I felt like that was what was going on with it. And certainly for book club, it just felt, it's I don't know. I suppose we had a fairly spirited discussion about it. It was quite fun. But I suppose as a read, it felt like such an endurance test.
I don't think you can recommend this as a book club book for at least another 5 years.
And then what with that? And then the emotional situation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, perhaps. But, I'd hesitate even to say right book at the wrong time, because I'm just not sure for me forever this would be the right book. I mean, Hilary Mantel was able to write about the Tudor age in a way that you felt like you were there. And I don't remember at any points in her book thinking, I don't understand what this character is saying to this other character.
Also, her characters feel so human.
Yeah.
They make unethical decisions sometimes, but you also understand why they've done that. And they have hearts and there's love there. She's brilliant.
And this is not that. It's a very, very, very different book. But, I can't dismiss it and say, it's rubbish, because it's not. It's clearly not. But I think collectively, we would have to say it wasn't for us. Okay. And I think you've had a real reprieve.
I wasn't going to touch it. Like, no.
But listeners, now at least I have mentioned it on the show and so faithfully discharged my duty as a book club podcaster to tell you about this book.
A very different historical novel. I read The Observations by Jane Harris when I was in Sicily, which is set in 19th century Scotland, so not a likely candidate for my Italian holiday, but I picked it up off the shelves of the Airbnb I was staying in, which we did an episode on summer reading, and we forgot to talk about the best bit of summer reading, which is the serendipitous discoveries on a holiday rental shelves.
Yes.
I always read those, above and beyond anything else.
Yeah, me too.
I don't know, there's just something about it. You end up reading something that you would not have found otherwise.
Yeah.
Almost always.
It's like someone else's selection of books.
Yeah, so there's always surprises in there. I mean, this book, The Observations by Jane Harris, is actually quite a likely candidate for me to read. Speaking of gothic covers, it's got a 19th century woman posing in dark greys, holding a little book of letters and, a script font for the title, The Observations. So I was like, yeah, I'm going to read that. 1863. Bessie is the young Irish housekeeper of a crumbling house tucked into the countryside between Glasgow and Edinburgh. She's only 16 and has stumbled into the role by chance. She's inexperienced with a questionable past, so why has her mistress hired her? What's behind the bizarre exercises she's tasked with every day? And why must she record her daily activities in a book that her mistress peruses from time to time? That's my description. The blurb was equally intriguing. And the narrator, Bessie, gets compared to Becky Sharp, Moll Flanders. All the little snippet reviews said she had this incredibly authentic, humorous voice. And that's all true. Bessie, as a narrator, is amazing. She's captivating. But the story itself just didn't live up to the promise, and it was quite disappointing. This is a bit of a spoiler alert, but Bessie has basically fled from childhood prostitution. Her mother was a prostitute who forced her daughter at a very young age, I think it might even have been 9, into prostitution. And Bessie has fled that, and obviously she doesn't know anything different. So the trauma of that, it could make sense, that she doesn't think about it in the way that we would. But tonally, it just felt flippant. I know she's the narrator, but I just felt like Jane Sharp wasn't doing it, the horror, the trauma of that justice. It's a good comparison with himself, because the violence in himself could be gratuitous. Like The Observations is quite funny throughout. But with Jess Kidd, something about that contrast between the violence and the humor and the magic realism makes that violence all the more horrifying and powerful and feel true. Whereas in Observations, I actually just found it quite off-putting. So all in all, I was just quite disappointed, actually, even though I think Jane Harris is a great writer. There was some sort of gap in the empathy or even the awareness of the author that was letting the promise of her narrative voice down. Sounds a bit harsh, but
it's almost more frustrating, isn't it, when you read books that you feel should be good because the writing is good and you want to get really invested in them, but there's just something about them that doesn't quite work, that kind of kicks you out. I always think those books are the most frustrating books.
I think so. And it's not even that there's something that doesn't quite work in the book. It's more like, this is a really direct criticism of the author, but it's almost like there's something that the author lacks, like some sort of wisdom, some sort of empathy, some sort of awareness that means that they can't quite create a novel that will move you. I don't know.
Shame.
It is a shame, I must admit. It's also really long. So I read like the first 150 pages with great enthusiasm on my holiday. And then as I became increasingly frustrated with the tone and the story was kind of limping along, I started to do a bit of a skim read. Finally, my last read, which I didn't announce, but Kate's looking at.
Well, this comes under the category of guilty pleasures.
Guilty pleasures, exactly, is Georgette Hare, The Masqueraders. I felt like I should mention it because often I think both of us slip in Georgette Hare novels into our reading and yet somehow just, fail to mention them on Bookshelf. It's almost like we're ashamed of it, Kate.
I think it's the opposite. I think I always feel like I go on about Georgette Hare too much. And then I realise just...
They are the ultimate palate cleansers. You gave this one to me, The Masqueraders, and I was so pleased because I thought I had read all of her novels at this point, but no, there's always another one.
Well, my sister found on eBay, someone was selling a box of every single Georgette Hare novel. So she duly ordered this. She already had quite a lot of them herself. So why she bought I think she just wanted the whole collection. Or maybe she's been reading mine and my mum's all these years, actually. That's it. And she sort of wanted her own set. So she kept some of them, but gave the rest to me. I then went through them and whittled out the ones that I know are good. from the ones that I know are not good, because not all Georgette Hairs are written the same.
They all basically have the same plot.
And I had a little stack, didn't I, of ones that I gave you that are the good ones.
Oh, yeah, and actually that's true. You have a few more for me that I couldn't take home.
Don't know what. We'll find them.
I read this in about 48 hours. So that's what you do. Well, that's what I do anyway. I just gobble them up. I can't put them down.
Yeah.
I'll stay up late to finish it. I find them deeply satisfying. If you haven't heard us talk about it before, they're all essentially the same. They're all set in 18th century England. I think there's one in France. I didn't like that one very much.
You say the same. I mean, they're not the same, are they? But it's the characters tend to be... There's always a sort of spirited heroine.
There's highwaymen.
With sparkling grey eyes.
There's quite a lot of...
There's usually a kind of, an earl or something who... There's more to him than meets the eye. They fall into types, actually, Georgette Hair characters, don't they? There's a dictatorial godparent or uncle or something, who has these kind of wayward charges he has to shepherd through
through to marriage safely.
That's definitely a type. And then there's your rake, your kind of dilettante hero who's not really looking for anything serious, and then along comes your heroine and suddenly he's bewitched. And then there's your sort of, almost like good, honest farming types who are really most at home in the countryside and are just looking for like a decent woman. I don't know. Sometimes there are gunshot wounds. Sometimes there are duels.
There's almost always a duel, yeah. Duel. There's usually someone who has a gambling problem.
Yeah, there's always a pleasing amount about, millinery and buying dresses.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Very detailed descriptions of the gentleman's clothing as well.
Yeah,
she was very interested in her fashion.
And the thing about them is, she writes absolutely brilliantly. She really does. There's just a kind of sparkling wit and kind of effervescence to the dialogue that you just love. These characters leap off the page, and it was all underpinned by really serious historical research. She didn't want to be a romance writer. She thought they were really trivial. And I think she was always a bit dismayed by the fact that people liked them so much. What she wanted to be was a serious historical writer. And in fact, the non-fiction books that she wrote, or the fiction books that were outright historical, everyone hated.
Have you ever read them?
No, because they're terrible. It's so boring. She was no Hilary Mantel.
Oh dear.
And this was the thing that she was really, really good at.
Yeah. Oh, I loved them so much. I read it in the bath. It was great. Terrible book club book. People, don't do it. And it might not be for you. My cousin, who I could have sworn would love these, is like, Laura, there's far too many cousins marrying cousins. I was like, what's a minor detail? Not in every book.
Wow, gosh, who could not love a Georgette Hair book? You've got to give them the right one, though. The Grand Sophie, I would say, is the one that really is just objectively good. You don't have to be partisan to appreciate that one, because that one is, everything about it is sort of perfect. But I think there are a lot of other ones that are almost as good. Masqueraders, I think, is sort of mid-tier Georgette Hair, but definitely on the good side rather than the bad side.
All right, that's enough Georgette Hair.
We should do a special. I feel like we could talk about her for hours.
We could.
Hey, so speaking of guilty pleasures, I realise I forgot we haven't talked about the Pellinor novels.
That's true.
Regular listeners may have heard this a few episodes ago. Laura flagged up a book by an Australian writer called Alison Croggon called The Gift. And we were talking about journeys, and you flagged this up because it's a fantasy novel, it's set in a fantasy world, but at its heart is this journey that these two main characters go on. And you sold it to me. You're like, there's this girl and she's kind of a slave in this camp, and then this sort of man shows up, a magical whose name is Cadvan the magical man. he's a bard, and in this world that means that he has a gift of magic, and it turns out that the girl, whose name is Mirad, is that how you pronounced it?
That's how I would pronounce it.
Mirad also has the gift. And then over the course of this novel and then 3 more, there's a kind of epic quest. They go on, and they, as you said, the dark is rising.
It's basically Lord of the Rings.
Well, this is the thing. One of the things I loved about it, and there were many, but one of the things I loved about it was very derivative of some things, like, for example, not so much the books of Lord of the Rings, but funnily enough, the films of the Lord of the Rings. I really felt like she really had absorbed those and was reflecting them back a little bit, but in a way that actually was really pleasing. It felt like, to me, almost like a light kind of homage to these great fantasy books. So Lord of the Rings, definitely, but there were other ones in there.
Robert Jordan's novels.
Bit of Earthsea, I felt. Even books, kind of obscure books, but there's one, there's a series I read when I was growing up by an author called Susan Dexter that I loved. And in that, there was a whole thing about a winter king and a land of ice, and then there's touches of that thread of this. And maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it just felt to me like someone who had really read widely And that there were just these delightful little touches that almost echoed other books in a way that was really pleasing rather than annoying.
But didn't you feel too that it was like a refresh of those stories?
Yeah.
Because without wearing its feminism heavily, I mean, we have a heroine.
Yeah.
And it's her story. We are given her female perspective.
Yeah, very much so.
Even down to her having like cramps when her period finally comes.
Absolutely.
Which comes very late because she's been a slave and malnourished until however old she is in this book. 17 maybe when it starts. Just really light touches that actually spoke to real life and real female experiences.
Yeah, it really did. She was such a great main character, and it really is her story. And I love the way that even though you have these really charismatic male characters around her, she is always the focus and she's the one you care about. It's just so well done. She's brilliant on atmosphere. She's brilliant on things like food. Very often they have these meals and you're really like, oh, that sounds so delicious. You wish you were there. She's very good on those kind of moments of intimacy between people that felt really vivid and real. I felt a little bit frustrated with the first two books. It's so focused on Mairead and Cadvan. I almost got a bit bored. It's just very intense, this relationship between the two of them. And then to my relief, in the third book, which I think really needed to happen, she widens it out. And it turns out, well, there's another character who kind of becomes the focus for that novel. It just broadens out the scope. Suddenly you get a sense of other people and other places, and it widens out that world before then drawing it all together really beautifully, I thought, in the fourth book. The third book also is very hard to read. It's genuinely quite distressing. It's like, it's the third one of the Lord of the Rings. It's the one where things are getting destroyed and people are being killed, and it's really quite grueling and relentless, and it felt like a bit of a slog. But then the trade-off is that it's kind of earned the resolution, the conclusion that you get. My only frustration with it was when I finished it, I really was like, oh, she ended it like that?
Okay, don't say any more.
It felt too quick to me. But then I reasoned afterwards, and she does give you a really lovely epilogue. So a bit like Tolstoy with that nice epilogue at the end of War and Peace, you do get a sense of then almost like what happened next, which you're really craving. But I just thought, in a way, afterwards, I enjoyed these books so much. I think however she ended it, I would have been frustrated just because they stop.
Are you very envious of the fact that I have actually only read the first book? That you lapped me 3 times?
I'm astonished because I read the first book and there was no way I wasn't going to immediately read the other 3.
I'm back to my required reading problem.
Well, I'm also on the same...
I don't know how you do
the same Booker program. And then recently, I wasn't going to do it. I wasn't going to go there. I was a bit like, I have to just stay away from these Pellinor novels. I just have to. I mean, I think definitely, there's obviously, you always know there's other things feeding into this. It's a bit of a weird time. It's coming into autumn. It's sort of depressing. These books were just a delight and an escape and a really fun read. I mean, there's lots of reasons why I love them as much as I did, but I found myself, it turns out there's a prequel, which is Cadvan's story about how he almost came to be then standing outside Mairead's cow byre in the first novel. And I was like, well, I'm going to read that. And then I read that, and then almost without meaning to, I found myself reading The Gift again.
Well, the thing is, you and I both love fantasy novels, but partially because we read them as teenagers.
I think so, but also it's so rare to come across a good one.
Exactly. I love them, but most fantasy novels I always read them on Kindle. I usually download the sample, read a couple chapters, and I'm like, no, because the world doesn't work, or the characters aren't empathetic. There's just so much wrong. Yeah. Whereas this one, I'm glad you think very on point.
I did want to flag it up because it has been a total reading delight that maybe I wouldn't necessarily trumpet to the world the sheer amount of time that I've spent reading these books. Well, now I have, actually. Now you will know.
Has she written any other books?
Yeah, I think she has. I think she's written... I don't think they're in this world. I think they're different fantasy books. But
exciting.
She's happily prolific. Oof. And, seems to be like, I don't think she's old. many happy writing years.
Exciting.
Maybe like Georgette Hare, she'll have 40 books.
Perfect. Yeah. That's what we're after.
Exactly. That's all for this episode. On our next book club show, we'll be discussing Bonjour Tristesse by Françoise Sagan. And until that comes out, if you'd like to keep up with what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com.
And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts? If you like what we do, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe to us. In this time of corona crisis, when people need good podcasts more than ever, it helps other listeners find us and means you'll never miss an episode.
But for now, stay safe, read some great books, and take care.